Work away.
Okay, great. Thank you and welcome everyone to the Genealogical Society of Ireland. It's the evening monthly open meeting. And the title of this talk is Genealogy, an Alternative Route to History. Professor Robert Dudley Edwards and the Transformation of Historical, Archival and Genealogical Study in the 20th Century by our distinguished speaker, Neasa MacErlean. Neasa is the author of the biography Telling the Truth is Dangerous, an account of how her grandfather, Professor Robert Dudley Edwards, transformed the study of history in Ireland in the 20th century in collaboration with his Trinity peer, Professor Theo Moody. She is a journalist, formerly of the Irish Press, the London Observer, and the Lawyer magazine. A literature graduate, she founded the work pages on the Observer, aimed at helping individuals navigate the workplace, and in 2015 she founded Robotics Law Journal. With a mathematical background through her qualification as a chartered accountant, she is particularly interested in the use of statistics and digital data to understand current events. She is now freelance, writing about finance in her journalism and other historical and literary issues in her other book projects, and she lives in Galway. So with that, I introduce Neasa McErlean, and I hope I pronounced that right, Neasa.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Lovely. Well, I'm actually in my kitchen, but I have to stand up when I speak, so that's what I'm doing at the moment. Shane, you could show that first slide of Dudley, if yeah. There you go. Yeah, great. And even the next one actually, so so that we can see what Dudley looks like. He was known as Dudley, and was a very famous character, not just in Dublin where he was from, but throughout Ireland. So I'm talking about genealogy as an alternative route into history, and the role of Robert Dudley Edwards, my grandfather, and as it's told too in the book that's just come out about him that I've written. And forgive me, because I always have to do a slightly roundabout start to whatever I'm talking about. If we look at the past, history, the current academic study of history isn't the only way to look at the past. There are various alternatives, and I just make a parallel about to that. If we look at something very simple, 2 + 2 = 4, there's numerous different ways that we can get to that. That's the arithmetic way. You can do it through algebra and equations. If x = 2, then, or you can plot it on a graph. You can have 2 on the vertical, 2 on the horizontal axis, and you get 4 squares. You can do it through the minus. If you put -2 in brackets and then square it, that gets you to +4. And because 2 is an exceptional number, you can get 2 × 2 = 4. So it so often happens, I think, in life that we just think there's one route, but actually there are numerous routes, and the others are yield all sorts of unexpected ideas when you start going down those routes. You could just put up the second slide just briefly, Shane. I think that's the one of the book itself. So I'll just give you an example of. Yeah, I'll just give you an example of the alternative ways to explore something through history and other routes. If we looked at the rise of fascism, the rise of Hitler in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, we could explore that through historical biography of history of Adolf Hitler. We could explore it through cliodynamics, that's a new way of looking at history, which is looking at mathematical calculations to look at the past to see what were the preceding events before sorry, I'm just slightly distracted by the screen here. Yeah, what were the various events that led to conflict or the rise of a dictator, and what you get the same events occurring in history. You'll get a big gap between rich or poor often will happen before the rise of a dictator or a war. So those are two ways of looking at the rise of fascism. But a third way could be, well, you could look at it through genealogy, of course. That would be really interesting to look at, you know, how long people were living, what occupations they were in. Obviously, anyone with Jewish backgrounds, their genealogy was going to be absolutely awful in those days. But you get the story of what happened by each of those different routes. So I better just apologise to you. I'm going to tell you a few things here and there, or mention them anyway, which you know already and know vastly more than I do. And I'm going to start off here. Of course, history, starting off with genealogy, going back into the Bible, going into Genesis, going into the Quran and the tracing of Abraham, going back to the Roman and the Greek gods. And also going on to Irish folklore. And in both of those last two cases, you have very interesting characters where you have people who are half god and half mortal, because then you're getting the connection with the god, the religion, which society follows, and a half human person, Achilles in the Roman stories, or Cuchulainn in the old Irish ones. You get the half human person, which connects the glorious myths into us today by becoming half human. So why do we have so many versions of that story, the genealogy, and then the link to the gods, and then the link to us? There was a great book that came out just last November by the Israeli historian Noah Yuval Harari. It's no coincidence that he's an Israeli historian. He's very interested in trying to prevent war, and so he's looking at evolutionary history and what causes conflict. And he says in this book, Nexus, all human political systems are based on fictions, but some admit it and some do not. Being truthful about the origins of our social order makes it easier to make changes in it. So he's talking there about how religions develop and how they're communicated to societies through these genealogies, and how we have to adapt to them today and accept that some parts of them are mythology, but that the values maybe that they describe are important to us. So he also says in the book, he's talking about religion being the glue of society. Once you get bigger and bigger societies, bigger, say, than a small village, you need something quite big to create an identity that holds everyone together. And he's arguing that the most important function of religion has been to provide superhuman legitimacy for the social order. And actually, yeah, Shane, you could just put up the next slide, which is of Cuchulainn, the front picture of Lady Gregory's 1902 book, the Tales of Cuchulainn. And this was so interesting in Ireland, published 1902, and played a very big symbolic role in the years up to 1916. And this book would explain partly why there's that beautiful statue of the dying Cuchulainn in the GPO, just a few meters away from where Patrick Pearse read the proclamation. because there you're getting that great link with the past and the values that were given to young men at that stage of our history to sacrifice themselves at a young stage for a cause which was bigger than themselves. Very sad, very noble, and beautifully told in Lady Augusta Gregory's Cuchulainn. So if we jump forward from there to UCD, University College Dublin, about 100 years ago, the professor of early Irish history at UCD and Dudley's teacher was Owen MacNeill. Owen MacNeill, better known obviously as the founder of the Gaelic League, and better known too for 1916 in trying to call off the uprising. But he was the author of several books about dynastic succession, and in earlier Irish history, so in the first millennium and going up to medieval times. And he and Kuno Meyer over in Berlin were probably the two great experts in the world about this link with the old past. He wrote books such as The Irish Law of Dynastic Succession in 1919. And although these he was investigating something so 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, it actually bears relation to our life today very specifically in this example that I'll just give to you. The fisheries cases. I don't know if anyone would remember ever having heard about the great fisheries cases. These were cases in the 1930s and 1940s when a company called the Irish Society and other companies tried to claim that they had the rights to fish salmon and other fish in Loch Foyle, also on other waterways, the Erne, the Bann and the Moy. And Owen MacNeill was the great expert witness starting off on these cases, and he had an understudy who was Robert Dudley Edwards. Sorry, this is back to front. You have to on the book here, the title Telling the Truth is Dangerous. But his understudy was Robert Dudley Edwards, and they both gave evidence on these on the rights of the local fishermen in Ireland. And who could fish there? Was it this company, or was it these fishermen who'd been fishing there, and their families for hundreds of years? In the big case, the last one, the Foyle, MacNeill had died, and Dudley was the main expert witness, and that they won that case for the fishermen. The evidence had been going right back to the Bible, right back before time immemorial being defined as 1189 when Henry II died in England. And it has relevance today because when eventually there were other legal developments after this case, which incidentally was the longest case that had ever happened in a courtroom in Ireland. It was 48 days at that time. It was that tangled up. So after the case, other legal developments, eventually what happened was around the world, in other countries too, in Australia, generally we started to decide these cases not by going back so much into what had happened maybe 2,000 years ago, but just human rights. So now it tends to be based more on human rights legislation, but you wouldn't have got the human rights legislation if there hadn't been quite a good argument built up that all these fishing families had a good right to be fishing there. And in fact, in the Good Friday Agreement, 1998, there's a section in there which is about the fishing, the management of Loch Foyle, because it's on the border there, and so it's still a live issue today. Now it's overseen by the Lochs agency. So Dudley became professor of modern Irish history in 1944 at the age of 35, at a time when the study of history was being changed probably more than it had ever changed. And that was because the world used to follow the model that the British had introduced, which was that history, the academic study of history, was the study of progress. But when we come to World War II and there are 53 million casualties, there's the Holocaust, and the major European countries are on their knees, they're bankrupt. You couldn't call it progress anymore. So different approaches had to be brought into what was history, and Dudley was someone with a very flexible mind and very interested in the sources of history, and he delighted in this, and he was the person who helped introduce all sorts of other specialist branches of history. So he was very much encouraging local history, social history, eventually women's history, military history. The military history was set up, the first association here in Ireland, 1949. And into this very changing idea of what was history, eventually Dudley became interested in the Genealogical Society side, which I'll come on to in a few minutes. But there still remained underneath history. You had two strands, really. You had the mythological side, which could be some of the details about St. Patrick. Were they true or not? Had St. Patrick really expelled snakes from Ireland? Well, no, he hadn't expelled snakes from Ireland. That was pretty symbolic, that there hadn't been snakes in the first place. But what that was saying was we were trying to get rid of evil. So it was a value which was inspiring still to people. So it's part of history in that sort of way, but not true factually. So there's that kind of mythological history, and then there's the facts and figures history. And Dudley was probably, you could call him the father of archives, really, in Ireland. He was the person more than anyone who was saying, after the forecourts had the records in the forecourts had been lost in 1922, but burnt down. Dudley was saying we really need to keep our records so that we can actually talk about history and be confident that what we are talking about is actually true. We need those documents. He was also worried too that in these two sort of different kinds of history here, the mythological and the factual side, that you could get a very heady mix of, it could be used as propaganda, which you can see all the time. You know, I suppose historians create history and an interesting narrative, and then can hand it over to the politicians, who will build up the story that they want based on that. When Dudley actually did start to make a bit of progress on introducing archives, he found that the politicians were very reluctant to have archives enforced upon them, because it tracked them really with records for the decisions they'd made, people they'd ignored, you know, constituents whose letters they hadn't replied to. They didn't really want all of this going on. And interestingly, our president, Michael Higgins, was recently in Galway, just last month, donating part of his archives to the university there, and he talked about how he was advised sometimes just to shred his records, because the records of when he was dealing with constituents, because that was easier than having a trail of what had actually happened. But what was in politicians who did shred these documents were shredding history. And it was partly because of his awareness that documents were being destroyed all the time, that Dudley became so interested in the family side of history. And in 1972, when he was 63, and therefore starting to see, he knew that he would be retiring in a few years, and that maybe he wouldn't have many years to be able to persuade the government to set up national archives. He was looking at other ways of getting into finding historical evidence, and so he delivered the O'Donnell lecture under the title Irish Families, the Archival Aspect, and this was published as a large pamphlet or a book a couple of years later. And he was pointing in this towards the rise in genealogical research later on in the 20th century and in this century. And one of the things he said was the approach of the archivist can establish the validities of community development more critically than has the historian. A slightly unwieldy way of writing, actually. He could write in ways that were a bit heavy sometimes. But what he's saying is that archivists and genealogists could produce better results than the historian, which was a very interesting claim coming from someone who was a traditional historian. He was a Tudor historian. And the other thing that's interesting just about that sentence there is he's talking about communities. So he's talking about communities, not the state, because history tends to look at the state. Most history books will be about state borders one way or another. I mean, even my own book here is it's about how he changed the way that history was studied in Ireland. So there's me open to these ideas, still writing it within state boundaries. Whereas what Dudley is stating here is, why don't we look at communities as an alternative to the state? I think he was very much ahead of his time. I mean, obviously I'm very biased. I'm his granddaughter, but I think that was the case, and maybe we will see more history written as community history, and within that family history, and within that the genealogy role in future. So genealogy would, as I imagine it, would be a kind of social history, or just give you an example of how the development of the family changed history, the historical events critically in Ireland, and that would be the Home Rule movement of Charles Stewart Parnell. And Dudley, writing about that, talked about the role of the family, and he said, there is no doubt that the emergence of the middle-class Catholic families were responsible for the new development. Before 1880, there could not have been an independent Irish state. 2 generations later, the establishment of self-government was made possible by the great strength of family feeling. And what he was saying there was people becoming educated, realizing, following current affairs more, really caring about it, understanding how home rule could change, and independence would change their lives. So there's Dudley really giving a slightly different view of history, really, in not just the the great person view of history. It's the great people that change it all. Actually, he's saying that it's coming from the roots up. He wasn't, although he was encouraging different approaches to collecting information, such as genealogy, he wasn't rosy-eyed. He could see that there would be problems here. So he talks about the records of the old workhouses and the poor law guardians, but at the same time, he can imagine that families could be upset at the idea that they'd be finding out about their grandparents, through their records in the workhouses. And he says, the record of poverty and degradation can be uncongenial to the investigations of subsequent generations. For instance, here in Galway, we've got in the courthouse, the wonderful courthouse just around the corner, we've got records going back 100 years of court decisions, but they're not being examined by people, as far as I know, probably because that's quite difficult, partly too, to go back and look at your great grandfather being sentenced in a court. Although it could be very interesting sociologically, it's painful to look at. On the other hand, one of the interests that Dudley had was he he knew that he, as a Tudor historian, he had plenty of material. He knew what Elizabeth I's signature looked like, but he knew that he was only looking at that top tiny strata of society, especially in Tudor days, and that the vast majority of people were completely unrepresented because they couldn't probably read or write, and therefore they left no records whatsoever. And so he saw family history as a way that might give us a better understanding of the vast majority of people who were left out, up until probably about 100 years ago, when education spread to the majority of the population. And another quick point here. When Dudley was interested in genealogy, he also was interested in a way in the sort of parallel development in the business community. He could see that you had families where a lawyer would have encouraged children to be lawyers, and they would all stay in the same business, or drapers or bakers. You often see the business being passed down, and so Dudley was interested in finding those business records. There was some research done on this, a business survey, just knocking on doors in Louth, and that was very successful. And Dudley copied that in Dublin in the early 1970s, recruiting some of his young students to knock on doors, and go and ask the people running the businesses there if they had their old records. And we had people, John McMenamin, actually, the recently retired Supreme Court judge. He launched this book for us in Dublin just over a week ago. He was a student of Dudley's, and he was one of the people knocking on doors in Dublin. And one of the most interesting replies that they got was Cutler's, which is alas no more, I believe. They had these beautiful ledgers inside, some with wonderful handwriting, noting down all the transactions. Easter 1916, that beautiful handwriting had written in, the Feckers have the place wrecked. The human side there. Shane, could you put up the next next slide, which is it's inside the Epic Museum. I was there a couple of years ago with my friend Maria there, who's from New Zealand. Epic, all the records that people visiting that museum would look up to trace their ancestors. And Maria's had taken the boat out to get to New Zealand after the famine, to Australia, then New Zealand, and I found it very moving going around with her. And there are 300,000 visitors there a year, people who are interested, despite what I was saying about and what Dudley was saying about the painfulness of looking up records that maybe show how poor your family was and the awful circumstances in which they had to travel to the other side of the world. There's obviously a huge amount of interest, 300,000 visitors a year. And we're going to get, there's going to be another museum too, 2027. So in I think it's 2027. If not, it's next year in Sean McDermott Street in Dublin. And this is for the people who lived in the mother and baby homes and the orphanages and other institutions like that. People who were almost erased from history. I mean, maybe there was, in most cases, their births and deaths were recorded, but in an absolutely minimalist way. And when this museum opens up, it will have an archive section to it where people will be able to look up relatives or the people in the Galway mother and baby home or whatever. Another an area that you would really know vastly more than I do, of course, is how really since the days that Dudley was teaching history at UCD, how libraries have become involved in helping people trace their roots, the National Library and so many other libraries. What Dudley Dudley had faith in ordinary people, and he he would have been delighted at these developments, because he didn't think you had to wear an academic gown to be able to study history. In fact, he was the person, again, probably most involved in spreading local history throughout Ireland. He set up a campaign in the early 1950s to have every part of the country covered by a local history society, and I think I'm told that we've achieved that. I'll just for a little break for a moment, or almost, I'll just tell you very briefly about Dudley's own genealogy. As I said, he was a Tudor historian, specialising both in the Irish and side of that, and the English side, to the extent that it related to Ireland. And so Elizabeth I, the man that famously, obviously, never got married, the Virgin Queen, but the man that she was closest to getting married to was Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. And there were conversations in my family about whether we were related, and I think there is quite a possibility that is the case, because the Dudley's father was actually was English, from quite near Dudley, and the Dudley name figures there. He's a Dudley, and Dudley told my mother, who's the oldest of Dudley's three children, she seemed to think that there was a serious possibility of a connection. Owen Dudley Edwards, who's their second Dudley's second child, and also a historian, gave me an interesting answer when I asked him about it. He said that Dudley thought of the Dudleys, the historical Tudor Dudleys, as knaves, as knaves or fools, but he didn't actually seem to deny the possibility that we were related to them. So we might find out that Dudley was actually writing about the relatives, which will be fascinating. Dudley's father had started off Methodist, and then he became a Quaker. And just to mention that, it's interesting because the Quakers, it's very easy. You again know far more than I do. If you've got Quakers, you can go back beyond 1700 very easily, because instead of seeing us as having original sin, the Quakers see us all as having something divine. So the records of births, deaths, and marriages are really recording this divine manifestation that comes through us. Just very quickly, in case it's of interest, just mention, it's of interest to me, actually. I'm dying to tell you. So, inherited characteristics, medical conditions, I guess, which most families would have this. What Dudley had, and other members of the family had or have, a skin condition, psoriasis, especially under stress. And to be honest, I'm very happy to talk about this too, alcoholism under stress. And I think actually the alcoholism could have gone back generations. I'd love to see studies of alcoholism as a generational illness or condition, not just as something that the individual involved feels terrible about and doesn't realise that maybe 10 generations back the family, the problem existed then. And Dudley had another condition, and he used to wear a green eye shade because he very heightened sensitivity to overhead light. And this is one that I've inherited. I often wear a hat because for the same reason. For years I was wearing this hat and not making the connection to Dudley, but it's great to have this. I'd rather not have this sensitivity, but it's actually great to realise there's a similarity between me and my grandfather. Non-inherited characteristics seem to be height. Dudley was very tall for the time, 6 foot, and his brother was 6'4", and the two of them towered over their parents, who were 5'2" and about 5'9". I don't know what this is. The next category here. Dudley's 3 children all became historians. So was that nature or nurture? Sorry, all 3 of them studied history at university. My mother, Mary, and then the other 2, Owen, and then Ruth Dudley Edwards, became historians. Changing tack a bit, we're in a leaving Dudley really for a minute. Where do we go from here? Immigration is such a growing issue around the world. So will genealogy become more important, more controversial? What's going to happen there? I put this really as a question. I don't have an answer, but if you look at you remember when Donald Trump was saying that Barack Obama hadn't been born in America, and of course Barack Obama had been born in America. He had been born in Hawaii, but probably most of us remember that story. Something like that stays in the mind and is quite damaging. Looking at universities and the study of genealogy in universities, there's there's a lot of it going on. Not that I know that much about it, but in Limerick, Cork, UCD, Trinity, and the city colleges, I think. One of the things I just talk about very briefly in the book is Dudley talking about what is history. When I say talking, he wasn't actually talking about it. He was making notes in his journal, fascinating journal. He was reading Herodotus, and he was saying to himself, writing to himself, why is Herodotus known as the father of history? And he says it's not because he's recording the narrative, it's because he's asking the question, why did this war happen? So it's the why question, I think, that dominates the study of history in universities, and why, I guess there would why, I don't know to what extent does the why question dominate genealogical study. I'm sure it does, but maybe we don't know enough about that side of it. I myself could see genealogy, absolutely would see it as part of multidisciplinary studies, which seem to be becoming much more common these days within within medicine. You know, the DNA tracing of characteristics, you know, the studies of those communities in Italy and South America, where so many people live very long lives. It still seems to be a mystery, really, as to why that is. We haven't really managed to nail down enough about that, because we'd all be trying to copy them. Neuroscience too, a fairly new. It's an an area that's been transformed by the screening of the brain and the body just in the last 10 years. So many gains have been made. You might probably you probably know more about this than I do, but I was looking at a podcast recently between the Stanford neuroscientist Andrew Huberman and someone called Dr. Melissa Illardo, and they were talking about people with blue eyes. And they were set their eye X. If you're a neuroscientist, very likely you'll know quite a lot about the eye, because apparently the eye takes up something like 40% of the brain area. And they were saying, both agreeing, that there are studies that prove that everyone with blue eyes comes from the same. There was one human being who had blue eyes, and we're all related back into that person. Up until that date, whenever that was, brown eyes were the norm. Then this one person, possibly by what you could call an error. Obviously, an error isn't really the right word for it, but a change in direction, had blue. Green eyes, by the way, apparently that's just a chemical difference. There wasn't an initial person with green eyes. And I guess I'd just throw out a question here to you. I don't know what the answer is, but genealogy, when we go back to times when not many people could read or write, they were at least getting the stories about who they were descended from, you know, in Ireland with the great folklore stories, and in the Bible and so on. And I mean, you might almost laugh, but I think there's in future there's going to be less written and more digital. You see the spread of TikTok and YouTube and the growth of podcasts just in the last year or two. How much are people going to be writing anymore? I'm just throw that up as an idea. And I'd like to look at what's happening in schools very briefly. In Dudley, although he operated in the universities, was very interested in what happened in the schools, because he was getting people coming to him age 18 who'd been taught rote learning of history, and who weren't asking any questions in their schools. And you couldn't really afford 100 years ago in your school in Ireland, or probably in England, to be having opinions, because you could get caned for it. You had to learn the national line and regurgitate it. Now it's very different, and the history the school syllabus has been changed quite a lot in recent years. In 2019, there was a battle about whether history should stay as should remain a compulsory subject beyond the age of 11 in schools. And after a tremendous battle, the history teachers won, and so now it's one of 4 subjects that remains compulsory for 11-year-olds onwards. Yeah, and more than that, what's happened is that the senior cycle examinations are bringing in projects which often are related to family history and local social history. So one of the people I interviewed for the book is Deirdre McMahuna, who was president of the History Teachers Association of Ireland when that battle was won in 2019. And she was telling me about what she does to teach her senior level students. She's actually stopped doing that now, but this was a few years ago. She was doing it. Sorry, she's teaching teachers in Trinity to be teachers now, rather than, that's why she's not doing this anymore. But from what she tells me, you'd often get history teachers now, they'll be asking their students to bring in artifacts from home, like an old wedding photograph or a medal or a teddy bear even, or a picture of a first communion. And Deirdre McMahuna was saying to me, it unearthed the most extraordinary stories every year when I did it. And she gave me an example of a 17-year-old, a photo, this is rather very sad, yeah, photograph of a 17-year-old who'd gone to war and were in the trenches. And on the back of the photograph of him was pinned his last letter home. But Deirdre McMahuna has been absolutely delighted in the way that this changed the approach to open the minds of the people that she was teaching, and kids started to realize that history wasn't just something very far away, facts and figures that meant nothing to them, that history was actually in their family, and they had come out, their families had changed because of history, and their lives were different because of it. And what she said to me, Deirdre McMahuna said, every parish in the country has a history society. History is important to a place. And then she said to me, this was 2 years ago, there's never been a better time to be a history teacher. The last point I'll make, just in a way, goes back a little bit to my first slightly obscure point about two and two. Dudley was 12 when Einstein got the Nobel Prize in 1921 for physics, and Dudley would mention Einstein whenever he got the opportunity, which wasn't all that often as a Irish historian, but he did get the opportunity sometimes. And one of the ideas that so many ideas that Einstein changed was, before, well, I remember thinking this, you know, we all know that parallel lines never meet. We were taught that in school, and we still remember it now. It was only a few years ago that I discovered that actually Einstein changed that. Yes, parallel lines don't meet in the traditional teaching of geometry, but when you're talking about space and space-time and the curves of gravity and waves, parallel lines, curved parallel lines can eventually cross. So I'm just saying that there's new ways of thinking. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Neasa. That was a fascinating journey, which took us, I don't know, from Einstein to mathematics to history to oral tradition to genealogies. And yeah, maybe to kick it off, to answer your question on the oral tradition, you and of course Dudley were correct that in Ireland before people were literate or records weren't written down, oral tradition was the only tradition. And in ancient Gaelic Ireland, it was passed down through filiads and druids and the learned part of Gaelic society. And it's reputed that those people had to study for many years, some say 12 years, some say 20 years, in order to memorize this and be able to memorize the history of their families and their clan and their tua. And all of that broke down in the 17th century with the breakup of the Gaelic society. And some of the old scholars at the time, like Robert McErlean, wrote them down before they were sort of eradicated from memory. And it's only very recently Professor O'Morala translated these and published them. So they are available now. But it was a core part of Brehon history. And the other point you talked about Dudley and the belief, or maybe his daughter's belief, your mother, which was Mary, believed that he was related back to Robert Dudley. And I began to have flashes of past Blackadder series, you know, of the Elizabeth I court and how chaotic it was. I think that would be very interesting to pursue further. And we are doing a genetic genealogy project to test out that hypothesis. And I was just wondering, you know, did he do some formal study of his own genealogy, or did he ever publish any of it, or have any other members of the family done so?
He didn't do that. No, in fact, I think Dudley was a complete workaholic. I suppose he was so busy. No, he wasn't a workaholic actually. He was so busy trying to set up the infrastructure of history that he worked 365 days a year, and I guess he neglected, you know, cobblers neglect their own shoes. So I'm afraid he didn't look back into that. Maybe it would have been a bit more difficult too, because he was based in Ireland, and then the records would have been over there in England. So it wasn't as if he could just go down the road, but he didn't. Yes, as I was saying, he wasn't full of admiration for Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, so maybe he was hoping that he wouldn't be proven to be related to this knave as he saw him.
Yes, and of course his work in the communities, the fact that nearly every community, or someone mentioned the parish, has a local historian, and I can see that, and the communities which are in my family tree they have amazing local history societies, and yeah, so if there was one thing we should be grateful to Dudley for, was making this happen, and certainly it has broadened interest in local community genealogy in Ireland. So at that point, I'll open it up if anyone else has questions, or maybe Shane, you've spotted a question.
Shane's on mute.
Oh.
Can't hear you, Shane.
Sorry. I had a howling cat. I had to turn the microphone off. No, I don't see any questions coming through at the moment. If you do have a question, unmute yourself like I just did.
Well, I'll echo what Gerda said there regarding the local history and the way local history has been a gateway for almost putting the family and the area into the narrative, the larger narrative, the one that was the official narrative, the official school history as such. A point I touched in the op-ed of the conflict that was there regarding that issue of the official narrative, and whether historians themselves did their profession and the whole issue of history and the teaching of history any good with this, the greening of Irish history, and then the zealous revisionism. And the argument that happened, it was almost like a schoolhouse fight between both sides of the schoolyard, where it didn't actually inform us or give us greater tools to interrogate our history. It created doubt, but it did not actually create a space for solid, or let's say intuitive questioning. So you're left with a situation where it was a case of people went into either camp, and finally that has waned somewhat. And now we have with public history, and that comes directly, I would imagine, from the local history and the interest there, that public history now, we have a responsibility to make sure that we're allowing for possibilities and not imposing a narrative, allowing the narrative to be interrogated within a structure, of course, like leaving out the conspiracy theories, or indeed the wayward ideas of the far right or the far left or whatever. But so that our history can be interrogated. And the tools for that, when you're talking about in schools or in universities, the critical thinking, the tools for investigative interrogation of the history is required. So if there's professionalism, has to have a focus, it has to be on the basis of equipping the student to deal with the subject. And I think then, as we all remember from our school days or our college days, the one issue that the professors always, or the teachers always put ahead of us was Cadi an Ceist, what is the question? And that is central to, you won't get an answer unless you first interrogate your question. And I think we're slowly but surely getting to that point where history becomes far more interesting to people because they can mine it in a way in which they can interrogate it. Almost when you bring the genealogy and the local history together, you're putting the family, the community, back onto the framework of history that the state has. The identity that creates, the solidifying of, let's say, an ownership of the past, and then from that, the correlation is the protection of the records of the past.
Yeah.
Sadly, when you were mentioning there, Neasa, about records, throughout Ireland at the moment, local authorities are digitizing their records, their housing records, for example. And people who are applying for local authority houses during the 1920s, 30s, etc. These records now are being thinned out, digitized, recorded what was there, but also anything that was there, if it didn't have to be digitized, it's pulped and shredded. Absolutely appalling. The letters, the pay slips, the supporting documentation, references, and all those gone. All we'll be left with is that our great-grandparents or our grandparents or whatever applied for a house. These were the documents that they submitted, but the documents themselves will be gone. And this is happening. I was asked recently, why didn't I have this raised in Dáil Éireann, for example? And I said, at this stage, it's not only has the horse bolted, but the horse is at the knacker's yard and slaughtered. We're at so far down at the destruction. And it's unfortunate. And I'm sure that your grandfather would have had an awful lot to say on that subject.
Oh, he absolutely would have done. He used sort of everything that he could do. He was trying to embarrass the government to stop it happening, giving talks, getting the German archivist in to say how badly we were destroying our own records, because politicians tend to sort of dislike that if you've got people from abroad saying how badly we're doing something. And eventually he got somewhere on it. But even so, the National Archives Act in 1988 leaves lots of holes in it, which are obviously being exploited. Yeah.
Well, there is a commitment to look at and we've been campaigning for that for years, to have a look at the National Archives Act of 1986, the Heritage Act of 1995, and the National Cultural Institutions Act of 1997.
Yeah.
And to have those not necessarily combined, though a composite piece of legislation would be useful, but there's structural points that make that difficult. But more on the to unify the vision for preservation, the types of preservation, the issue where certain records, even though they were created for a particular purpose, that we take an example from archaeology, for example, where in archaeology you look at a brownfield next to in a city, for example. The brownfield has archaeological potential because of its previous known history. But then you've got greenfields possibly not too far away from a known archaeological site. Well, those greenfields may have an archaeological potential. We should be looking at our records on the basis have they got a social history, genealogical, or whatever potential, rather than being simply records of X applied for a house or X had this thing done, this wall built. But unfortunately, unless we have that encapsulated in some way through legislation, it just won't happen. No.
And powerful people agree with you, like the president at the moment in his speech in Galway University last week, but hasn't managed to achieve change on that. The positive of sorry, no.
Paula?
So, are there other questions?
Well, I was just going to say thank you very much, Neasa, for a very interesting talk. And I found it interesting when you were talking about genealogies and the history of the family as against family history. And it's something that I have a bit of a foot in the camp of because I'm doing a PhD on women's history from the late 1800s. And it's taking a very different view. And I think this is the benefit of taking a genealogical approach, because you can get more granular data to basically either support or otherwise counter what we already know from, say, from a demographic point of view, from a population history point of view. And you can change the perspective away from what I think has been very much a stereotypical view of Ireland. So I think from a genealogical point of view, I think that's exciting. And I don't think it's something that we've harnessed fully in this country. It has been harnessed in other countries, but not here. And I think now is an interesting time to start doing that and start using the records that we do have.
Yes.
But I have to agree with Michael. Destroying archival material like that is absolutely appalling. It's absolutely appalling. I'm shocked at that.
Yeah.
And that also brings up the question of the 1926 census. Michael, do you know the latest position on that?
The minister has already said that it will be available to the public free of charge from the 18th of April 2026.
Oh,
Yeah, anniversary day of the census, I believe.
That's it. Yeah, that's when we were glad we kept the pressure up so that at least the records would be. They were first of all made sure that they were in good order for digitization, but also that the funds would be put there so that it would work towards that date, rather than have what we all understand in this country would happen. Oh, it's to be released in 2026, so we'll talk in 2026 about digitization. So it'll be 2036 by the time we get it out. But thankfully this time they've, with the pressure, that they've actually done this. But you said there, Nessa, about Michael D. Higgins. Uh, we worked very closely with Michael D. Higgins and with the senator in Pascal Mooney, who was the Fianna Fáil opposition spokesman during the passage of the National Cultural Institutions Bill at the time in 1996. And we worked very closely we were advising Pascal, but we kept a channel open to the minister, who was Michael D. Higgins.
yeah.
And
yeah.
I have to say that he was very receptive to all our views on that bill. And we achieved about 32, 33 amendments to it, which
Yeah.
improved it, including one which had that designation of records such as burial records and cemetery records, whatever the case, and school records, as records that could be prohibited from export.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And that was put in. We had Michael D. Higgins had a very good advisor, a man called Colm O'Brien, BL, a barrister. And Colm was very receptive to what we were saying. His view at the very start was, Michael, as you're going to Pascal, come to me so that we have a good angle on this. And it worked perfectly going through that bill. But that is the issue. What we got then was we all knew that we had to build on it, but unfortunately it wasn't built upon. That's the problem.
Yeah. It's funny that at the moment we have the museum in Sean McDermott Street coming on, and then like the government going in one direction with that encouraging, preserving, well, making access easy to those records, and at the same time this is happening, going in completely what you've been describing, going completely in the other direction, destroying records.
A part of the problem is the National Archives Act of 1986. It needs considerable updating, but it also needs to have a more overarching responsibility. There should be an officer, an inspectorate, if you wish, that can look at various records that were created in the state and determine whether those records have a broader historical potential. Therefore, they're not merely records of something, of the operation of that office or of that department, which may or may not have an interest. They have a wider social interest, a wider interest, for example, if we look at our built environment, or even the natural environment, how it was protected, how it was damaged, our built environment, how the various actors in that, how they contributed to it, the various questions that were put to the decisions made, all that type of thing. If they don't end up in the written record of the debates, the files that are the most important part of it will be I won't say will, could end up being shredded unless we have this overarching view.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
That's a personal opinion, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, And what's happening on that then, on getting the overarching view?
Well, see, the minister has already said that he's going to look at the Heritage Act of 1995. Now, we
Yeah.
got into that. We got into an amendment in there which includes genealogical records.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
primarily the heritage, that was Michael D. Higgins as well at the time. Garrett Fitzgerald was very interested in the 1986, the
Yes.
National Archives Act. It was him, it was his government pushed it through. But the problem with both is, or with all three pieces of legislation, in a digital world, they need to be updated considerably.
Yeah, of course.
But also, it has to, in updating to the digital, we do not want a officialdom to see the paper records as just holding space.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Yeah. Actually, just on a sort of a nice note about that here, it was Garrett Fitzgerald, yes, student of Dudley's. When Garrett Fitzgerald was a minister in Foreign Affairs, he was out in the back garden one day and he heard Dudley's voice coming over the wall, because that was where the archives department was. And it was through these conversations they had these conversations over the garden wall, Dudley saying, obviously briefing him on the need for archives. And that's discussed that here, because every ruse that Dudley tried got nowhere. But speaking to Garrett Fitzgerald over the garden wall, that was what succeeded.
Right, yeah. Well, look, I hear like
Okay. Yep. I will. If there are no more questions, I'll probably wrap up. And what I'd like to say, Neasa, thank you so much for that fascinating talk and a deeply personal thought about your grandfather. And we all know that the Dudley family were very talented family of historians through his sons and now his grandchildren. And you gave us a very strong sense of how genealogy and history are intertwined, not just through archives and documents, but through the memories and the oral history. And you reminded us that history is not only written by the powerful, but often preserved by the families and passed down through generations and rediscovered through research. And on behalf of everyone, I would like to give a sincere thanks again for sharing your time, your scholarship, and your family story with us today. Thank you, Neasa.